once worked together a long time ago. They're not friends now. They don't like each other. And yeah, 50 has taken every shot, especially when Diddy has been down.
I realized Big was that type of rapper that he could get at somebody, and I think Puff was trying to tell him, don't go that route. You understand what I'm saying? But still putting out songs like Who Shot Ya in the intro, but telling Big not to go at nobody, which was crazy.
As this pressure continues to build, reactions themselves become clues. Some figures respond by speaking constantly, offering accusations and commentary that sound raw, emotional, and sometimes impulsive. Others retreat almost completely, issuing only brief denials or carefully worded statements before disappearing from public conversation again. Observers within the industry say that contrast can be revealing. In their view, people who talk excessively often do so because they feel they have already lost control of the narrative, while those who remain silent may believe silence still grants them leverage. The difficulty is that silence changes meaning depending on context. When quiet responses exist alongside documents, recordings, and witnesses willing to go on record, that silence can start to look less like composure and more like calculation. And calculation invites scrutiny. Every unanswered question becomes an opening for someone else to supply an explanation, whether accurate or speculative. Analysts note that once that process begins, controlling the narrative becomes nearly impossible because interpretation spreads faster than clarification. The approaching trial transforms all of this from distant speculation into immediate risk management. Even without repeating the allegations themselves, the existence of sworn testimony alters incentives for everyone connected to the story. Individuals who once benefited from ambiguity may now face the possibility of fixed, on-record accounts. According to people familiar with high-stakes legal environments, this is often the stage when alliances begin to strain. Longtime associates reassess loyalties. Former adversaries reconsider cooperation. Those who once relied solely on reputation start thinking about documentation and corroboration. The underlying fear, insiders suggest, is not limited to verdicts. Conviction or acquittal are obvious concerns, but they are not always the most unsettling ones. The deeper fear is exposure of processes, relationships, and unwritten rules that normally stay hidden behind industry glamour. Trials have a way of illuminating how decisions are actually made, how influence travels, and how conflicts are handled when money, image, and power intersect. That kind of visibility can be more disruptive than any single judgment.
I believe it, because he wasn't talking just to be talking. I felt he was also coming straight because there was a big war behind that. A war that they lost. I think it was a war that destroyed their neighborhood.
This is precisely why the old studio incident in New York refuses to fade into the background, even when people avoid naming it directly. Its unresolved nature has, over time, transformed into something more than just an unsolved episode. For many who lived through that era, it functions almost like symbolic evidence, proof, in their minds, that betrayal could occur even in spaces considered controlled or secure. Those who claim to have been present describe it as a moment that permanently fractured trust, planting a suspicion that never fully disappeared. From that point forward, later conflicts were no longer viewed as random clashes or bad luck. Instead, they were filtered through a lingering question: was this chance or was it arranged? When artists begin directing suspicion not at rivals, but at executives or power brokers, the entire framework of the story shifts. It stops being about competition and starts becoming about governance, about who holds authority, who decides movements, and who determines which risks are acceptable. Seen through that lens, sudden travel changes or last-minute decisions no longer feel spontaneous. They begin to look like extensions of influence being exercised quietly, with consequences that only become visible afterward. Money, throughout all of this, keeps resurfacing as the constant thread running beneath everything. Not just the alleged million-dollar promise tied to the central claim, but also the smaller financial pressures insiders say define the environment, advances that bind artists long after deals end, expenses that follow them across years, and accounting practices that some describe as punitive rather than protective. According to those close to the industry, losses are often passed downward while control remains centralized at the top. In that context, the missing payout discussed in the allegations becomes more than a curious detail. It turns symbolic. If money was promised and never delivered, it could imply deception, interference, or a deal that collapsed before completion.
With the series, with the film?
I mean, I think the intention is to give a more full-bodied experience to what happened, you know, from from the people that agreed to sit down and to participate. And I feel like the film asks a lot of questions, you know, maybe more questions are asked than answers given.
The documentary also refuses to treat one tragedy as an isolated event. Instead, it draws a line forward to the March 1997 shooting of Christopher Wallace and presents both incidents as existing within the same ecosystem of rivalry, tension, fear, and miscalculation. According to the narrative shown, Wallace reportedly did not want to be in Los Angeles at that time. Travel plans were said to have shifted, and he ultimately found himself in an environment some considered hostile. None of these details alone proves anything. Yet when observers place them side by side, the pattern unsettles those who have studied these events for decades. Two globally known figures. Two shootings within months. Both cases unresolved for years. Both surrounded by warnings that, according to certain accounts, went unheeded. When that pattern is viewed next to allegations involving executive influence, financial leverage, and industry power dynamics, the story begins to widen. It stops feeling like a pair of personal conflicts and starts to resemble a systemic breakdown, something rooted not just in individuals, but in structures. By this stage of the narrative, almost nothing feels accidental anymore. And yet, paradoxically, nothing feels fully resolved either. The missing payout, the unusual travel details, the facilitator names that hover without fully entering center frame, and the lawsuit language that allegedly repurposes an old tragedy as intimidation. All of it forms a silhouette people recognize but struggle to define clearly. Insiders insist the greatest risk is not what has already been revealed, but what remains hidden. With a trial date set and rumors of additional documents still circulating, the question hanging overhead is no longer whether the story will expand, but who controls when it stops and what they might risk to contain it. As the situation continues unfolding, it increasingly resembles a pattern rather than a single explosive claim. Long before the current wave of attention, former associates described environments shaped by pressure, humiliation, and constant tests of loyalty. They say contracts, access, and professional opportunities were not merely business tools, they were leverage. When that mindset is projected backward onto earlier events, past incidents can take on new meaning. The drive for control, the resentment toward independence, and the fixation on alliances start to look less like personality quirks and more like features of a system designed to prevent anyone from drifting too far from its center. And systems, once established, rarely dismantle themselves without force.
Chaotic. It's hard to actually figure out what's what, but it's becoming clearer. It's becoming clearer and clearer, but
People said to be close to the process emphasize that any heightened attention is unlikely to be triggered by a single explosive revelation. Rather, they describe it as the result of accumulation. Over time, fragments that once seemed unrelated old interviews, civil filings, financial inconsistencies, archived recordings, and decades of unanswered questions can begin aligning in ways that attract formal interest. Investigative bodies typically do not act on belief, rumor, or public pressure alone. They move when patterns appear. Patterns built from verifiable links, money trails, timelines, and behavioral consistencies. When stories long dismissed as speculation start reappearing inside sworn statements or recorded testimony, the threshold for attention changes. Something that once looked like gossip can begin to resemble data when supported by documentation. Observers suggest this may be why certain reactions from involved figures feel restrained rather than confrontational. Public argument can sometimes counter rumors, but it has little effect on structured inquiry. Institutions designed for investigation do not respond to volume or charisma. They respond to evidence. This possibility reshapes how peripheral figures are viewed. Individuals previously considered irrelevant or safely distant from events may suddenly matter if they connect pieces others overlooked. Travel records, corporate filings, shell entities, or long-forgotten partnerships can take on new significance when examined collectively. In that context, even minor details can become important if they help establish timelines or relationships.
Saying that, Diddy, he put a hit out on you and Tupac, and that's the reason why Tupac got in Vegas. So, yeah, man. How you feel about that?
Well, first thing first. I mean, that conversation been out there. He put his truth out there. A lot of other people put their truth out there.
This is the point where the story begins to bend in a noticeable way. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis is no longer just a historical name drifting through old headlines. He has become the pressure point of the present moment. Charged in Las Vegas with allegedly orchestrating the shooting, he now sits at the intersection of past statements and present scrutiny. His earlier accounts, given years ago in entirely different circumstances, are being replayed, dissected, and reinterpreted not only in legal settings, but also in the court of public opinion. People familiar with legal strategy say this creates dangerous terrain because it blurs the boundary between testimony and spectacle. The resurfacing of his words is described publicly as clarification, yet it also locks him into narratives he has previously attempted to distance himself from. Each replayed clip, each quoted line, narrows the room for reinterpretation. Observers close to the legal process suggest that as February 9th approaches, the central question may shift. It may no longer be simply whether his account stands up under scrutiny, but who else could be implicated by it and who stands to gain or lose, depending on how it is received. In that sense, repetition itself becomes a form of pressure. Every time his statements circulate again, stakes rise for anyone whose name appears near them. Lawyers understand that public perception can subtly shape courtroom dynamics, even when jurors are instructed to focus only on evidence. That is why timing matters so much. The renewed attention is not happening years after the trial. It is happening just before it. Some analysts believe that coincidence is unlikely. They argue that in high-profile cases, information rarely resurfaces without someone anticipating its effect. For insiders watching closely, the tension lies in unpredictability. Trials can expose details that private negotiations never reveal. They can also freeze narratives into official records that cannot later be revised. That possibility forces everyone connected, even indirectly, to reassess their positions. Long-standing alliances can strain under that weight. Former associates may reevaluate what they know and what they are willing to confirm. In environments built on reputation and perception, the prospect of sworn testimony introduces a different kind of gravity. So as the date draws nearer, the atmosphere thickens. Conversations become quieter, statements more cautious, and absences more noticeable. The sense is not just that a case is approaching, but that something larger may surface alongside it. Whether that expectation proves accurate or not, the anticipation alone is enough to keep attention fixed on every movement leading up to the courtroom doors.
3 law firms on retainer. I don't know how much money is coming in, but I know that a lot of money is going out every single month for Diddy.
A $1 million betrayal is being dragged out of the shadows and forced into the open, and the silence that once smothered it is beginning to crack. For years, people treated this entire saga like a relic sealed in nostalgia, something buried under denial and time. But now it is moving again, alive like a live wire humming beneath the surface. What has recently surfaced does not read like harmless rumor or recycled history. It reads like leverage being pulled at the exact worst moment. A claim is circulating that insiders insist cannot simply be dismissed or walked back, and it arrives alongside carefully tightened public statements, guarded language, and reactions that feel calculated rather than natural. All of this unfolds while a court date inches closer and closer. A streaming documentary scheduled for early December 2025 introduces taped assertions suggesting money was once offered to make Shakur disappear. At the same time, journals reportedly kept inside a major label point to unusual travel activity connected to Las Vegas around the period in question. Meanwhile, Dwayne Keefe D. Davis sits formally charged with orchestrating the shooting and is set to face trial on February 9, 2026. Adding another layer, a separate civil filing alleges that a threat invoking Shakur's fate was used as a warning to enforce silence. None of these elements exist in isolation. The numbers, dates, and quoted statements sit side by side, unanswered and unresolved, like pieces of a puzzle nobody wants fully assembled. If all of this were truly nonsense, the reaction across the industry would likely be calmer, more dismissive, more unified. Instead, what observers see is tension, measured responses, selective comments, and long pauses where clarity should be. That pattern makes it feel less like a closed chapter and more like machinery still grinding somewhere out of sight, continuing work that never actually stopped. The sense is not that the story is resurfacing randomly, but that something has triggered it to move again now at this precise moment, when legal scrutiny is about to intensify. For longtime watchers of the case, the unsettling part is not just what is being said, but the timing of when it is being said. Timing can transform old allegations into present-day pressure. And pressure, once it builds, rarely stays contained. The closer the calendar moves toward that courtroom date, the more every statement, denial, and silence begins to feel strategic rather than accidental. What once looked like distant history now feels immediate, and that shift alone is enough to make even seasoned insiders uneasy about where this could lead next.
I think that the goal of what the film is trying to do is to let the audience kind of come in to ask questions like, you know, in a trial where there's so much media coverage, you know, before, during, and after, were their decisions, you know, colored by certain things, and who got the benefit of the doubt, you know, in that courtroom?
The documentary does not slip quietly into the public eye, nor does it pretend to arrive without purpose. Its early December 2025 release lands with striking precision at a moment when court filings, archived interviews, and internal notes have already begun circulating again among journalists, researchers, and industry figures. People close to the situation insist the timing is not about entertainment value or ratings. In their view, it is about pressure. The surface-level explanation sounds simple enough. A streaming series revisits old theories, restates claims long denied, and leaves viewers to draw their own conclusions. But that explanation starts to fall apart once you compare it to what is happening in real time. The series relies heavily on statements attributed to Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, the same man currently charged in Las Vegas and awaiting a February 2026 trial. Accounts he reportedly gave years earlier during law enforcement sessions are suddenly being highlighted again, repositioned as central rather than forgotten. Industry observers argue that this is unlikely to be coincidence. Reviving those statements now reshapes the atmosphere surrounding the case. Instead of a decades-old mystery quietly entering a courtroom, the narrative becomes volatile, public, and nearly impossible to control. That shift alone changes how people connected to the story behave, speak, and sometimes choose not to speak at all. At the center of the series is an allegation that money, specifically $1 million, was once offered to make a rival disappear, a figure tied to one of the most infamous shootings in music history. The claim is not framed as gossip drifting through rumor mills. It is presented as something allegedly discussed in private rooms, repeated in interviews, and carried through years of whispers. Viewers are told the amount discussed was substantial and that it may have involved more than one intended target. The number keeps resurfacing because it provides a stark, almost brutal logic. If a payment is named, someone must have expected to collect it. Yet the narrative immediately twists. Insiders point out that no payment ever appears to have materialized. Rather than weakening the claim, some believe that missing payout is the most revealing detail. A promised reward that never arrives can breed resentment, loose ends, and motives for people to speak decades later. The documentary allows that contradiction to linger unresolved, and in doing so, the silence around it becomes the loudest element of all. As the story deepens, its focus shifts away from chaotic street-level conflict and toward something more structured, more organized, and potentially more deliberate than anyone once assumed.
We haven't seen the indictments yet. There's been some time lag. I suppose it will take some time to go through all the forensic, evidence.
As discussion around the documentary spreads, old rivalries and tensions resurface alongside it. Commentators recall that certain figures who once worked together are now far from friendly, with some openly taking verbal shots whenever opportunity appears, especially when an opponent seems vulnerable. Observers point out that conflicts between artists and executives have always shaped the industry's most volatile chapters, and in hindsight, even creative decisions like provocative song releases or lyrical warnings can feel like early signals of deeper friction. These recollections frame the present moment as part of a longer continuum rather than a sudden eruption. Again, the narrative circles back to the central claim, a $1 million betrayal being forced into daylight. The language surrounding it is not casual. It is tense, deliberate, and filled with implications. Insiders say the allegation cannot easily be erased because it is tied to specific names, numbers, and recollections. The approaching court date amplifies that tension. Every resurfaced interview clip or archived quote adds another layer, making the situation feel less like speculation and more like a stack of unresolved questions waiting for a legal setting to test them. The documentary's stated goal, according to those involved, is to provide a fuller, more layered account built from participants willing to speak on record. Yet many viewers notice that it seems to raise more questions than it answers. That ambiguity becomes especially noticeable when another name begins appearing carefully, indirectly, but repeatedly. Eric "Zip" Martin is described by several voices as a connector, someone known for access, influence, and a reputation that travels faster than documentation. He is not portrayed as a central actor, but rather as a hinge figure who allows other pieces to move. The implication is not that he makes decisions or commits acts himself, but that he facilitates communication, logistics, and deniability. Outside the screen, industry chatter suggests this framing may be intentional. Mapping facilitators shifts a story from impulsive chaos to structured possibility. Structure implies planning, and planning implies awareness. Official responses remain consistent and dismissive, emphasizing denial and the idea that repeating claims does not make them true. On paper, that stance appears firm. In practice, critics say it clashes with visible reactions, limited engagement, selective replies, and long stretches of silence. Insiders argue silence can be strategic because responding too specifically risks legitimizing accusations. Yet that same silence can create space for speculation to grow, especially when detailed allegations sit opposite broad denials. The imbalance itself fuels curiosity, keeping attention fixed on what remains unexplained.
You got a lot of people playing both sides of the fence. But at the same time, if your name's Suge Knight, the authority's never gonna treat you fair. My whole case in this case wasn't treated fair.
What pushes this situation from the realm of industry controversy into something potentially far more serious is the growing whisper about federal attention. According to sources said to be familiar with developments, there is talk that investigators are no longer viewing the Shakur and Wallace cases simply as tragic cultural events from the past, but as incidents that might share underlying connections worth examining again. This shift is not described as a dramatic reopening announcement or a televised task force declaration. Instead, it is portrayed as subtle, a quiet adjustment in posture rather than a public spectacle. The suggestion is that files once left dormant are being reviewed again, not out of nostalgia but out of analytical interest. The reasoning, as explained by observers, is straightforward yet unsettling. When the same names, facilitators, financial questions, or logistical patterns appear across multiple catastrophic events, coincidence stops satisfying investigators trained to look for links. Even the possibility of renewed federal focus changes the atmosphere instantly. Influence that may function effectively within an industry environment does not necessarily operate the same way under federal scrutiny. Unlike public controversies, federal inquiries tend to unfold slowly and methodically. They rely on pattern recognition, documentation, and corroboration rather than speculation or reputation. For individuals accustomed to controlling narratives through image or alliances, that methodical pace can feel especially threatening. It means outcomes are not shaped by who speaks loudest, but by what evidence connects most clearly. Observers say that when word spreads, even unofficially, that federal eyes may be paying attention, behavior often shifts. People who once spoke casually grow cautious. Conversations that might have happened freely become guarded. Legal consultations increase. Distances appear between former allies. None of this necessarily confirms an investigation, but the perception alone can influence decisions. In high-stakes environments, perception frequently shapes reality.
Well, you know, I think that the biggest marker of what makes this film or the series different is how much time we took into putting into the making of the film, doing our due diligence to get the right voices, you know, to the table, and you know, this is a series that spans over 30 years, so just by covering that much time, it took a lot of time for us to dig in and to kind of make sense of the story and to put this time.
The deeper the story is examined, the less it resembles a closed case from another era and the more it feels like a system still quietly in motion. What once looked like scattered incidents across the 1990s now appears, to some observers, like fragments of a larger design that only become visible when placed side by side. Allegations about money, influence, and intimidation no longer sit in isolation. They echo each other, reinforcing a pattern that people inside the industry claim has existed for years beneath the surface. The rumored $1 million promise, the missing payout, the resurfaced statements, and the renewed legal scrutiny all point in one direction. Pressure is building, and pressure tends to reveal what silence hides. Those watching closely say the most revealing element is not any single accusation, but the reaction surrounding them. Some figures speak rapidly and emotionally, as if racing the narrative before it settles. Others retreat into carefully measured denials or complete silence. That contrast itself has become part of the analysis. In high-stakes environments, behavior often communicates more than statements. Silence can signal confidence, strategy, or fear, sometimes all three at once. And when documents, testimony, and timelines begin circulating publicly, even silence starts to look like a decision rather than an absence. The approaching courtroom proceedings amplify everything. Trials do more than determine guilt or innocence. They create official records that cannot be quietly revised later. For individuals whose reputations were built during decades when documentation was easier to obscure, that permanence can feel threatening. Industry analysts suggest this is why alliances sometimes shift just before major legal milestones. Old loyalties are reconsidered, former rivals reassess each other, and people who once relied on influence alone begin thinking in terms of evidence. The fear is not always conviction. Often, it is exposure of relationships, decisions, and mechanisms that were never meant to be examined publicly. Rumors of renewed institutional interest only intensify that atmosphere. Even the possibility that investigators might be revisiting old material can change how people behave. Records that once seemed irrelevant gain new importance. Associates once dismissed as peripheral suddenly matter if they connect timelines or financial trails. In such moments, history stops being memory and starts becoming data. And data, unlike rumor, can be tested.